Welcome back to Strange Exiles, a podcast about ideas, identity and ideology. I'm Brammy Gieben, and this month I was speaking to an old friend, writer and practicing magician Ian Cat Vincent. Cat and I met a few years back through comic book forums, and I went on to publish some of his early writing. He later went on to take a big part in the publication and writing of Fortean Times. We spent an hour on the phone talking about everything from the archetypes and symbols of superheroes to the subjectivity of weird shit in general. We discussed the super gods theory as put forward by the comics writer Grant Morrison, and talked a little bit about Cat's own work with superhero archetypes in his ritual practice. If you've not come across modern magic practice before, we talk a little bit about chaos magic and the roots of magic as it's practiced today by probably a surprising amount of people. It's a very rich subculture. We talked about the notion of authenticity and how much that matters when you're constructing a ritual practice for yourself. And I asked Kat about the rise of the far right and a kind of accelerationist tendency in magical circles, something that's been a part of the neo-folk scene in the last few years as well. We talked about the roots of science in magic. And of course, Kat was able to tell us about his work over the last few years, including working on an adaptation of Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger for the stage. For now, get comfortable and let's get into it with Ian Cat Vincent. So I wonder if we could kick off by getting you to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and kind of what your role is in society.
I'm Cat Vincent. I was christened Ian Vincent, but I got nicknamed Cat at school and it stuck. I've been a magician for nearly 50 years, practicing since since I was about 7 years old. Life got weird. I had to find some way of dealing with it, and using the metaphors of magic and the occult were my way through. And since then, I've been doing weird shit for people, both professionally and just, as favors. Then I started to write about it about 15 years ago, which as I recall, you were the first person to ever publish me.
That's right, back in the Weaponizer days.
Way back in Weaponizer, which was such a boost for me. And after that, I actually became a professional Fortean journalist. Somehow managed to get myself considered a world authority on the subject of the Slender Man, which I did the Fortean Times cover article for back in the day. And since then I've been doing like spoken word stuff and workshops teaching people how to access weird shit without having to jump through all the kind of hoops that traditional magic and witchcraft say they have to. So in short, I do bad weird shit.
Excellent. So, I guess a place to start, if we're unpacking this for an audience that might not be familiar with it, would be to kind of have a look into what do you define as magic, if that's not too huge a question?
That's always just the hugest question. There's that old bastard, Aleister Crowley. His definition of magic was the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with the will. And later on, a writer, an American feminist witch called Starhawk, amended that into quite a nice, concise version, which is magic is the art of changing consciousness according to the will. The idea being that, to a degree, we filter out an awful lot of shit just physiologically. Our senses are very limited. They're very narrow. There's a lot of stuff we filter through. Of the stuff that actually gets through, all of that gets filtered again through our consciousness, the symbol sets that we've developed, either taught to us in childhood, learnt at school, or developed ourselves. So there's like two layers of filters. There's the physiological one of sense data, and then there's how we interpret sense data. And so when something odd happens, you interpret it very much on the basis of that internal set of maps. And what a magician does is that they use those maps to try and affect their minds in such a way as to perhaps tweak reality a little bit, or at least to seem to, even if it's just a kind of positive thinking kind of trick to make your brain work better. And there's an awful lot of people on the kind of atheist materialist side of chaos magic who would use that as their ongoing metaphor, is just the idea of, I'm just tricking my consciousness to do weird stuff. But those of us who think that doing that weird stuff can actually affect reality, even on some small level, we chain together bunches of symbols, or we borrow symbols from other societies, cultures, the past, and we filter that information that we get through those. So that thing where you get a synchronicity, where you sort of walking along and, the classic one here, the great Discordian one, is seeing the number 23, like, everywhere. Once you read Illuminatus or done any of that stuff, the number 23 just keeps fucking popping up. Now, is that just you're noticing it more? Or have you somehow affected reality so that it actually comes up more? We can't really know the answer. I don't think there's any way that you can objectively say which of those is true. But if you assume the weirder answer, you can have a lot more fun.
Excellent. So I guess when people think about magic and the occult, certain things come to mind. They might place magic along the lines of fairies and J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and that occult, that British tradition going all the way back to Shakespeare. And probably beyond that as well. But they might think of it as something apart from the world. And same with the occult, they might have negative associations with that, think it's kind of devil worship, summoning demons. But from what you're saying, it sounds like, a modern magician might view magic more as a combination of, the symbol reading that almost goes into an academic knowledge of culture, combined with a kind of approach that's almost psychological. Would that be fair to say?
That's certainly fair to say about some people, particularly on the tendency that generally gets called chaos magic. I mean, I hang out with a lot of the guys who would identify as chaos magicians. But for me, it's never a term I've been quite comfortable with. I always prefer either multi-model, after Robert Anton Wilson, or postmodern magician. Because my own readings in it, though I'm not an academic, I dove quite deep into postmodernism, post-structuralism, a lot of stuff from Baudrillard about hyperreal. Was a big influence on my thinking on that. But yeah, there's some people who will just roll with the traditional stuff. They tap into an ancestral kind of current, whether it's an actual quote tradition. There's a lot of people who think that, for instance, Wicca, the modern idea of witchcraft, is an incredibly ancient thing, and it was passed down from mother to daughter through thousands of years, past the burning times and through to now, when it's in fact like less than 100 or so years old. Was basically invented by Gerald Gardner after nicking a whole bunch of Aleister Crowley's ceremonial notes and hanging out with a couple of the old traditional cunning folk. He combined that lot and made a kind of formal practice of it. And there's a lot of people who work in those kind of stuff. There's people who work in actual traditions that you can show have a background. A lot of those would be African diaspora religions and systems, such as Voodoo, Santeria, all those guys, where they hid it in Catholicism, used elements of Catholicism as kind of a cover story, and so the Loa that they work with were identified as saints, and that way they could smuggle a lot of the older traditions, stuff they brought in from Africa during slavery and so on. And all those things kind of mixed together into various different kinds of blends. So that is a tradition where you can show. So people have been doing that kind of work for centuries and actually show a through line. But the thing is that I've found in fiddle-arsing around with all this stuff for like half a century is that you can go that way, or you can literally just make shit up. And if you've had some practice in doing this generally, or if you're just so inclined, then you can make that stuff work. One of the things that chaos magic was notorious for introducing was the idea that you can work with pop culture entities. This was first suggested, I suppose. Yeah, Robert Anton Wilson was really kind of like the first big popularizer of that. Although there's elements of it that go back to, oh God, I can't remember the bugger's name. Kenneth Grant. Kenneth fucking Grant. Because what happened with Kenneth Grant is during his fascinating but kind of interminable series of books. There's 9 of these fuckers and they're huge. The Typhonian trilogies. It's literally a trilogy of trilogies. But he was the first guy to put forward the idea that H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos could be used as magical current. He treated it as though it was real, that Lovecraft genuinely had a contact with some kind of occult force, and that this influenced his writing. Probably not true. Lovecraft was notorious for writing letters and keeping diaries, and we've got all that information. And he never actually studied or practiced magic, as far as we can tell. But that idea got planted. And then Robert Anton Wilson in Cosmic Trigger started talking about the idea of using Mr. Spock, for example, as an archetype of rationalism, of logic, but also as kind of like a liminal character, being half human, half Vulcan. And he compared him to the peyote spirit, Papa Mescalito. And there's a cute little drawing in Cosmic Trigger where you've got a picture of Spock and you've got a picture of Mescalito, who looks kind of like an elf with the pointy ears. And so between the two of them in the early mid-70s, this idea was planted that you could work in pop culture and treat that as a belief system. The trick in chaos magic is that you can work with the belief system temporarily. You do not have to convert to a faith. You can, just for the purpose of the experiment, of the ritual, say, right, for this one, I am going to believe in Batman. Batman is going to be a Loa for me, a spiritual connection. He's going to be the archetype of vengeance, of darkness, of honor, of strength, and all the other stuff you can associate with Batman. And so you get a picture of Batman, you put him on the altar, you watch a lot of Batman movies, and stuff starts to happen. And you start getting that little kind of tickle, that chill up your spine, that autonomous sensory meridian response feeling, that tingly thing. You know, you get there's something moves you emotionally, and you just get that chill up your spine. A lot of magicians try to generate that, and they kind of use that as their energy. It's like the chi is moving when they're focusing on this thing. So, I mean, I've actually run a group on Facebook that I inherited from a writer called Taylor Elwood, who's written 2 excellent books on pop culture magic. A couple of years ago, I inherited his Facebook group, and so we talk about this idea all the time. This is actually, weirdly, this makes for quite a good example on how the idea of a canon in both literature and the occult can be a really dodgy consideration, because obviously in magic, well, you've got the thing, as you said, with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and those kind of traditions, which come very much from both a rural and a Christian background, which that kind of tilts their theology and their internal mechanisms quite considerably. But there's later writers who worked with magic, such as my beloved and sadly departed friend Diana Wynne Jones, who was a huge influence on writers like Neil Gaiman. But she never let herself be limited by that kind of Christian thing. And Diana was interesting because she actually studied English under Tolkien at Oxford. And grassed him up because he kept bunking off, giving them lessons to fuck off and go and write Lord of the Rings, and she thought she was getting an insufficient education as a result. So yeah, you have this idea of like setting up a kind of literary canon of this wide spread of stories, but they all come from a very similar root. But then you go back and you look at Batman, you think there's 80 fucking years of Batman. Which one am I going to work with? Am I going to work with the original one who used guns? Am I going to work with the Adam West one? Because, there's always that sense of ludicrousness in magic, which I think is something people can be really, really po-faced about this shit. Like really, really just po-faced. They take themselves so seriously that it kind of makes them fragile. Whereas I find if you can actually take your magic seriously when you're doing it, but then step back and take the piss out of yourself a bit, then that is immensely beneficial. And this comes back to a line of Austin Spares, where he talks about the importance when you're doing this kind of weird shit to treat the stuff that happens to you as if it was real, but not as real. That slight difference of withdrawing from it, of being not a true objectivity, because this is the most subjective field of endeavor I think humans have ever come up with. It's all so intensely personal when you're talking about magic and weird shit. Even if you're completely copying someone else's work, even if you just take an ancient grimoire and work with it. And there's people who do excellent work with that. There's a guy called Jake Stratton Kent, who is a superb writer, heavy into chaos magician, working class lad, and just decided he was going to study the old school grimoires and has become kind of an expert on it. And so he wrote basically all his magic just works from one single grimoire, the Grimorum Verum, the Green Book, and he gets amazingly good, solid magical results out of that. But at the same time, he's aware of the chaos magic tradition, so he's able to explore those things without necessarily swallowing the entire theology. And I think that's an important thing, is you can't believe that what you're doing inside your head, however big and grandiose and spectacular it seems inside your own head, it's not necessarily that impressive, interesting, or useful to anybody outside it. Can be sometimes. Sometimes you can have a connection with people and share ideas, and that works really well. But most of the time, it's people arguing about, oh no, you can't do that. Your candle colour's too wrong. But the thing that I always admire most about chaos magic is the fact that it's completely prepared to adjust itself on the basis of actual experience. That it's developed as an idea. I mean, if you go online and you start talking about chaos magic, invariably what you'll get, and this is partly Grant Morrison's fault, is, it's just drawing sigils and wanking on them.
Yeah.
That's kind of become the great trope of chaos magic these days, but there's a lot more going on to it than that. And the better writers, the group that came out of Stoke Newington in London and in Leeds, from the people who used to go to the shop Sorcerer's Apprentice. I'll talk about people like Pete Carroll, Phil Hine, Dave Lee, Ramsey Dukes, the original Illuminates of Thanateros, the IoT, the first ever chaos magic organisation. We're drawing ideas from fractal mathematics and old traditions. A big influence was Terry Pratchett. Early Terry Pratchett, because the idea of the 8 colours of magic, which has become the absolute bedrock of their system, is that there are 8 kinds of magic. Each one is set to a particular set of emotions. It has a colour, it has a whole set of associations to it. But they literally use Terry's pattern, including the 8th one of Octarine, the 8th colour, which is the colour of magic itself. And so they drew on that. They drew on Michael Moorcock.
Funnily enough, just a complete digression, which I might cut out of the show, but I've been reading Jonathan Hickman's X-Men run, Dawn of X, House of X, and what you were talking about the different versions of Batman through the ages. I think what Hickman has a kind of Grant Morrisonian ability to take all the different eras of like a huge section of the multiverse of Marvel and make them all sing at once. And it's like if I was going to invoke a set of magical creatures to help me, probably the X-Men might be where I'd start. And he's got them all living on an island, like all the bad guys, all the good guys, all the random minor characters that were a terrible idea from the 90s. They're all there.
Oh, lovely.
So that's an act of magical writing for me, in the same way that the Invisibles was, is that, you know, and he does these wonderful pages where he's kind of got like inserts which are just kind of world building, and they're not comics, they're just pages of text. And funnily enough, the latest arc of that is based on the tarot. So do you think there's a sense here's where this actually leads into a question. Do you think there's a sense where maybe comics have kind of opened the way for like a context where this is able to be talked about in a serious way in public, away from those cliches of the occult and of the fairy magic?
Oh, absolutely. Let me just there's a book on my shelf which I will drag out because it's literally about this. It's by a guy called Christopher Knowles, and it's called Our Gods Wear Spandex: The Secret History of Comic Book Magic, where he draws on this idea, and it's one that Morrison also later develops in his book Super Gods, that comic book characters have literally become the modern pantheon. For people who aren't traditionally religious and want to get away from that because of, you know, all the problems of, you know, inherited religious beliefs and dogma and fundamentalisms of various kinds, that you need something to kind of fill that gap. And for a lot of people, comic book mythologies do that job very nicely. They have a tremendous power. I mean, I don't know if Hickman's a practitioner, but obviously Grant is, and Alan as well. So, of course, Alan Moore has capital letter V views on the subject of how superheroes have badly dented society.
Yeah, he's kind of got this riff about infantilization, and I think that would be my note of caution about the super gods kind of theory, as Grant and others have kind of outlined it. It's just how easily they're commodified, and that I guess goes back to Baudrillard and to you know, like the whole idea of the society of the spectacle, Guy Debord. Yeah. You know, if you invest these symbols with power, they can also be co-opted by power. Do you think there's a danger of that with magic becoming more mainstream, that it could be put to more devious ends in a kind of way that's like about controlling society, or is that already happening?
There were some people who would definitely say that's already happening. The influence of chaos magic on some of the people in Vladimir Putin's circle.
Are we talking guys like Surkov and things like that?
Surkov, yeah, exactly, that guy. Yeah, I mean, there's no question that they kind of cherry picked a lot of the ideas out of postmodernism and kind of adapted them far quicker than the left did.
Yeah.
So that idea of the quote from an anonymous White House source under George W. Bush is saying, "We create our own reality these days," and that's been true, and they are using a lot of those kind of classic sigilization techniques in a lot of ways. Going back again to Robert Anton Wilson, who was like, when I first read him in my teens, it was just so influential and important to me. And in the last few years, since I've been doing a lot of work with other Discordians and kind of like the British Current, based around the Cosmic Trigger play, we've been doing a lot of work and a lot of thought on that, which is how I ended up doing a ritual 4 years ago in London at the final showing of the stage version of Cosmic Trigger. This is a live stage performance of Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger, adapted into a 3-hour play by the daughter of Ken Campbell, who was the guy who adapted Illuminatus in the first place, and she didn't want to do that, but she wanted to honour her dad in some way, so she adapted Cosmic Trigger. It's a fantastic play, it's so good. And I was involved quite early on in doing some magic rituals to try and help that happen. The first one I did was a public ritual in Liverpool on Matthew Street, which is associated with both Carl Jung and the Beatles. It's where the Cavern Club was. And on the site of the Cavern Club is more or less the site that where allegedly Carl Jung was dreaming of in the dream he describes in Memory, Dreams and Reflections, where he dreamt of Liverpool as the pool of life, a kind of centre of the cosmos, even though he'd never been there. And years later, Ken Campbell established the Science Fiction Theatre of Liverpool in a warehouse just above where the Cavern Club had been, and first staged Illuminatus. So we did a ritual there. There's a tacky Irish pub on the site now. So it was like 50 of us, after having done like a preview of the play, went out there and we did this magical summoning where Daisy Campbell called on Eris. John Higgs did a little bit, the splendid writer whose work I recommend to literally everybody listening to this, read John Higgs, and me. And I did a summoning. Since this was Liverpool and synchronicity, and since Alan Moore had announced he was going to be involved in the play, he recorded the voice of the supercomputer Fuck Up and also did a video as Satan. This show has Alan Moore playing Satan.
Amazing.
Yeah. So on this site, I summoned the spirit of John Constantine.
No way.
Why? To help us bring enough synchronicity to make the play happen, because at that point it was being crowdfunded, and we didn't know it was going to happen. So it was like 23rd of February, 4 years ago, I did this working, and I've been doing a lot of work with Conjob ever since.
Really?
And I established a kind of set of rules for working with John Constantine, which is he's fairly biddable. I mean, it's easy to get hold of John Constantine as a magical figure. You can read the comics, you can get little plastic dolls, you can watch the TV show. But there's basically two rules. He likes to drink, he likes his silk cut, but never, ever call him your friend, because bad things happen to John's friends.
That's a good set of rules. That is completely in canon.
Yeah, and I've worked with John quite a few times, and we've got this kind of quite buddy relationship going. I picture him in my head, and it's like we have kind of like imaginary conversations, like Socratic dialogues. Some people, when they talk about having contacts with spirits, that's what they mean. Is it's like you have a version of it in your head that you kind of like talk to. Some people get things that really do look like actual proper fucking appearances of spirits. And the funny thing is, John is one of those entities. You know the story about how Alan Moore physically met John Constantine?
I think I have read that. He encountered him in a pub, didn't he?
There was a sandwich bar on in the South Park. This is back when he was still writing Hellblazer. And he was sitting there, and this guy who looks exactly like John Constantine walks in. Like the spit of him. Didn't look like Sting in a trench coat. He looked like John. And Alan was sitting there going, fuck. And the guy kind of like gave him the nod and walked off, and then thought to himself, now should I go and follow him? Or would that not be the best thing to do? And he decided against it. Oh, it's obligatory. If you can talk about Alan, you have to do the voice. So years later, like 2 years ago, as a result of working with the Cosmic Trigger crew, I actually got to know Alan, and I had the pleasure of getting stoned with him one night in Northampton and just talking about magic for a few hours.
Oh man,
which was exactly as glorious as you would think. Alan is a really biddable guy. He's a lovely, lovely man, as long as you don't talk about two things: the comic book industry and Grant Morrison.
Mm.
If you avoid those two subjects, he's an absolute sweetheart. So we were talking about stuff, and I talked a little bit about how I worked with pop culture stuff, and we were like comparing notes on some of the magic and rituals that we've done. And I allowed myself this one moment of being a fanboy, where I said to him, mate, I have to thank you for creating John Constantine, because as a working class magician coming up, there were no archetypes for working class or urban magic. I was born in '64, so this is way before the internet, and way before the wonderful new subculture of urban fantasy came up. The only urban magic book that I read before reading Hellblazer was Alan Garner's Elidor,
classic.
Lovely, lovely story. It's about a group of kids on a bomb site in Manchester in the late 50s who find a unicorn just running around the back streets of Manchester. Glorious book. But even there, they're spectators. They're not participants in that sense. They're not magicians. And then in comes John Constantine, aggressively working class. And that was such an inspiration to me, and so many other working class magicians coming up. So I just had to allow myself to say, Alan, thank you for creating him. And he paused, and all he said with this slightly worried look in his face was, yeah, it was really fucking weird that time he turned up. But the thing is, Alan's not the only one he's turned up for. Pretty much everybody who's written Hellblazer and half the people who drew it have had similar encounters, and most of them aren't magicians. I mean, Alan is, but, you know, Garth Ennis isn't. Brian Azzarello had an encounter with him, and he's really quite sort of materialist, as I understand it. But the guy keeps showing up, and this is one of the reasons why I get really kind of dubious about the idea of traditional magic systems being the be-all and end-all, is because fictional characters show up sometimes more often than the, quote, real gods.
Yeah, I mean, by the logic of something like American Gods, that would be absolutely consistent, because they've got more current kind of belief invested in them, perhaps, than a more traditional figure.
Yeah, that's an idea I first glommed onto, again, from an explicitly atheist writer. And that was Harlan Ellison. Back in 1975, I think, he released an anthology, which was one of the books that basically helped me keep my shit together in my teens. It was this book, Colin Wilson's The Occult and Robert Anton Wilson, the collection Deathbird Stories. And in the introduction to that, Harlan has this wonderful long speech about these are the stories of the new gods, the gods of neon, of automobiles and slot machines, of concrete. Because when belief in a god dies, the god dies, is what he said. Those are explicitly exactly the words he used. And a lot of people have connected with this idea. And obviously, I don't think that's quite true. I think all these things kind of like wait somewhere, possibly in Alan's idea space. But there's the potentiality that you can just rediscover an old god and start working with him. And they go through currents. There's a real thing at the moment for rediscovering working with the Saint Cyprian, who is the patron saint of magic. He was an interesting guy, and a lot of his stuff has been absorbed into the African diaspora belief systems through the Spanish and Portuguese traditions. So there's like this whole kind of countercult of working with Saint Cyprian as kind of like an intercessor of magicians, who was basically a black magician who got converted into Christianity because he saw that Jesus was more powerful, blah, blah, blah. But so he's got like a whole new cultus developing over the last few years. Chaos magicians like Gordon Wyatt referring to him and saying that you should work with them. But I'm looking at it and going, it's like, yeah, I mean, that's all very well. But I could just literally smoke a silk cut and talk to John. And he speaks my language. Everything connects. This is the thing. When you're a magician, it's like everything is connected to everything else. It's like you don't notice when the synchronicities happen. You notice when they stop.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've been involved. Okay, there are three major areas of magic I've been involved with, and we've kind of touched on one of them over the last 3 years, and that's the Discordian stuff I've been doing. The second one, which again I promise we'll get to eventually, was when you mentioned Hexit.
Yes.
And the kind of anti-Brexit rituals I've been doing.
So this was kind of a form of political magic. Would you say, does this fall under the description of combat magic?
Yes. I mean, combat magic was something I worked on a lot because I just, when I was younger, when I was first starting out, I was like, so if people had weird shit problems, they came to me because I was the weird shit guy. And a lot of that stuff was, I think I've got a curse. Which happens to a lot of people. It's like when you have a run of bad luck that seems just really aggressive or something like that. Some people just go, "Oh, what's that curse?" And I started to like just develop a set of techniques of like talking to people and asking them. And it's like, checking it's not just coincidence or bluntly a mental health issue or something that could be fixed by mundane means. Yeah. But after that, there was still some kind of really weird stuff. People had like odd objects that, when you feel them, they feel like really cold and tingly. And it's just like, I think there's something wrong with this. It feels like there's a curse in it. And after years of this, I kind of developed a set of techniques to try and break these spells, to try and remove the bad shit. The voodoo and hoodoo term for this would be uncrossing.
So that sounds like kind of defensive magic.
Yeah, it's defensive, but it's. I compared it to bomb disposal.
Okay.
A few times, where the thing is, that if I actually knew a guy who was an ex-sapper, British Army bomb disposal dude, and he was a magician, so this developed my ideas a lot on that. But the idea that a curse or a spell or anything like that, it's a construction. And if you're going to be a bomb disposal guy, you have to be really knowledgeable about how to build bombs. So through the process of becoming a curse breaker, I became really good at understanding how to build curses.
Mm.
And I developed a kind of like a whole sort of subset of both techniques and theory about how curses work and how they can be disrupted. And as a result of, again, through the Discordians, a guy called James Burt, splendid guy in Brighton, connected me up with one of my all-time favourite bands, the independent outfit, The Indelicates.
Mm.
Superb husband and wife team out of Lewis, actually. And it turned out that their upcoming album 3 years ago was going to be a protest album about Brexit. It's called Juniverbrecher, German for June Criminals, in which they basically took the archetype of Mr. Punch as kind of like the ultimate nasty villain from British culture. And they said, the Mr. Punch current has continued to the modern day. Jimmy Savile was possessed by Mr. Punch, and so is Boris Johnson. And so they did this album riffing off of this idea. So twice live and a third time last year on Halloween of the online event, which is called Hexit. I did this set of rituals where, I mean, it was very clear that we couldn't stop Brexit. I mean, after the referendum, it was very clear that they were going to make this happen, come hell or high water. So what we did instead is we cursed it so that even if they did succeed, it wouldn't do them any good, and it would just, they wouldn't get anything they actually wanted out of it. And I was very, very specific on laying it into Johnson on the last one, or on the Hexit one. It went something like, so Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson, you consider yourself cut from the same cloth as Winston Churchill. Very well then. May the black dog haunt your steps. you will wish you had died in a ditch.
Wow. And I mean, funnily enough, he does look fucking haunted these days.
Doesn't he? I mean, I'm not going to like take credit for that, but I'm totally going to fucking take credit for that.
But in a way, like what you've been saying is that it's less about taking credit for it and more about saying, well, okay, this synchronicity that I desired did occur. So it's more about noticing than it is about causing. Is that right?
Yeah, to a great deal. I mean, I think it's important that a magician be like really, really egomaniacal when they're actually doing the magic. It's like, I have the power within me to force my will onto the entire universe and change it to my whims, while you're actually doing the work. But once you've done that, you need to step back and go, okay, that was really interesting and fun. Let's see what synchronicities pop up as a result of that, but not to take credit for it, just to kind of go, okay, that makes an interesting pattern. And to try and work with those patterns and those sets of associations and build your own language, your own maps.
Yeah, and that kind of like echoes what I've read of Austin Speer, where, you know, he talks about the state of neither.
Yes.
And also, I guess, with the chaos magic stuff, where when you're doing the spell, you kind of have the intent as intensely in your mind as you can. But
Yes.
that after the spell, the better that you can forget it and kind of sublimate it, the better it works.
Yeah, one of the great tricks that the IoT like to do after a really big ritual is they banish with laughter. They just stop everything and they just piss themselves laughing.
Yeah.
Just to kind of break up that very dour, very solemn and kind of pretentious spirit that can often hang around behind that. So that's the two of the three things that I've been mostly up to in the last 5 years. The third, which is why I have some views about the idea of idea space being perhaps not entirely the full explanation, is working within a fairly recently invented fictional universe called Hookland. Now, Hookland started out as a series of tweets and a couple of articles on an online fanzine that was done in the style of kind of like a travel guide, the sort of thing you used to be able to get in SO stations. Kind of like you get the local guide to whatever county you were driving through, and have little things about what the local sites were and a lot of, you know, places of interest, people of note, historical stuff. Just these little volumes.
It kind of had a similar vibe to Scarfolk initially, I thought.
Yes, it does have that similar kind of flavour. And there's other things. There's the American podcast Night Vale, which also does this thing of creating a completely fictional place. So you can have this idea of the psychogeography as somewhere that doesn't exist, which is about as postmodern as you can get. Now, the thing about Hookland is that it started out, the guy who created it, David Southwell, who is just the most fabulous human being. I'm honoured to describe him as my sensei. He started very early like I did. But he also had a sideline as a true crime and conspiracy journalist, like writing on this shit for years. But once when he was at the BBC, he had a chance encounter where he was able to blag a lift in a taxi with J.G. Ballard. So he gets himself in the thing. He lied about the taxi. Oh, yeah, going my way. Can I jump in with you? So I sit in the back of this cab with Jim Ballard, and they're just having a natter. Because, you know, why the fuck wouldn't you if you had the chance? So he's just hanging out with Ballard, and they get talking. And Ballard stops suddenly. He says to him, "You need to write about place. Nothing without a sense of it is worth a damn." And that changed his life. That moment, it's just like a couple of years later, the entire Hookland universe downloaded itself into his head and has been writing about it ever since. But to the point where there's now like horror novels set there. There's a couple of movies. There's a trilogy of orchestral suites based on the mythology and the folk practices of Hookland. And this completely fictional place has become so real to people like me and loads and loads of other people online.
I absolutely feel you on that. Like, I've been following the Hookland stuff, and I sometimes when I take a picture, I just think that's from Hookland.
Yeah, absolutely that. And so what I kind of say about it is, Scarfolk is the fictional place where if you were there, you'd want to try and escape. Night Vale, particularly for American and queer people, is the place where you want to go. But Hookland is the place where some people just remember they came from.
Yeah, and it very much fits with the writings of Mark Fisher about hauntology and that kind of stuff. Hookland is a very much a Fisher-verse in my mind, anyway.
Absolutely, yeah. Also worth reading on this kind of stuff is a guy called Gareth Rees, who's just released a book called Unofficial Britain, which is about finding the modern folklore mythology of urban commonplace places. He did a book a couple of years ago called Car Park Life, which was literally just about car parks as a place of liminal encounters.
Yeah, liminal spaces between places. Yeah,
absolutely that. And his recent book kind of expands on that idea, and they're both just absolutely bloody brilliant. And I think it's the first chapter of Unofficial Britain is talking about electricity pylons. And he specifically refers to Hookland and the mythology of the children of the hum. The hippies who used to follow pylons and the electricity lines as though they were ley lines.
Which also takes us back to ASMR, I guess.
Doesn't it, though? Yeah, again, it comes down to this essential subjectivity of weird shit. It's something that happens to you, and how you respond to it is partly up to you, but a lot of it is kind of like imprinted fairly early on, and you can train yourself out of these habits. A lot of magic is like, repetition and training yourself. It's almost like advertising in a sense. It's like taking a set of symbols and just repeating them over and over again until they take on a particular meaning for you.
Yep, which is, I guess the idea of the hypersigil.
Yes.
Something that with those imageries and rituals and codes buried throughout it.
Yeah, I'm not sure David would cop to Hookland being a hypersigil as such, but it is absolutely an act of magic which is grounded in place.
Yes, and in people too, because it's kind of collaborative. It's an internet thing.
Yes, it's so open. The fact that he made Hookland open source. Yes. Deliberately so. Literally, the only rules are: don't take credit for it. If you're going to make something that you sell for money for it, give us a credit, and no fucking Nazis.
Yes, no fucking Nazis. Which actually, you talked earlier about Wicca and how people think of Wicca as a tradition going back centuries, but that it's a fairly modern thing that kind of like placed itself as being endless or timeless. And I kind of feel the same thing about paganism, like modern paganism.
Sure.
That while it's a sincere and deeply held belief, it's a recreation of something that was essentially erased from British culture, such as, if such a thing exists, by the Romans. It's like, and by Christianity, it was thoroughly stamped out. This idea of what we've forgotten, can it be recreated in the now, in the real?
Short answer, no. What you can do is you can do something that honours it. Not everything about those traditions was destroyed. Some elements remained, often within folklore, within folk culture, within things like Morris men practices, and just those weird little rituals that small villages have.
Or they were incorporated, like moving the dates of Christmas and Easter.
Sure, there's some controversy as just how much of the Christmas and Easter stuff actually was pagan. It's just like every year, my dear friend Adrian Bott, who I've known for over half my life, is an occultist and a scholar of the occult who's gone back and investigated all this stuff, and particularly about how this idea that Christmas is a pagan festival, really, it doesn't quite hold true. If you look at the most of the symbols of it do come from 15th century German Christian traditions. And that whole idea of, oh no, it's the remnants of the old religion, doesn't quite hold. But there's no reason, because it's not actually quite true, doesn't mean you can't work with it, can't find something genuine. Because if you can work with John fucking Constantine, you can work with Herne the Hunter.
So you very much believe that it can be authentic without being kind of like rigidly connected to tradition?
Authenticity is a movable feast. I think what you have to do is you can always draw on yourself and find that inner authenticity of the thing that's absolutely true and holds value for you. But the trick comes when you try and impose that meaning on other people. Because, for example, the pagan Wheel of the Year, okay, lots and lots of pagans talk about this idea that there are these distinct festivals. There's the 4 main Sabbats, and then there's the 4 Esbats on the other side. And it's like, you got your Lammas, you got your Imbolc, you got your Beltane, and all these different festivals. And so Mabon, that's the one. They actually invented the word Mabon as a term for harvest festival. And this was just some American pagan guy in the 80s, literally just pulled this out of his arse. But they've been treating it as canon ever since. Lots and lots of pagans will honour the Wheel of the Year and hold genuinely valid, beautiful, meaningful ceremonies on those dates. But there has never been a single historical culture until now which has worshipped on all of those dates. Nowhere. The guy, Professor Ronald Hutton, he's extensively gone into the actual history of witchcraft, particularly British witchcraft, and shown where the gaps are and where the stuff has been made up. But at the same time, he does honour the fact that paganism is a genuine, powerful, beautiful religious belief. So that idea of authenticity is, and that's again an idea from chaos magic, is that authenticity is not actually necessary for a magical or religious experience.
We have this idea of the separation of magic and science and even statecraft, which is completely nonsensical if you apply that to the Elizabethan court, say, where you had John Dee. The fusion of what they saw as like spiritual beliefs or philosophy or scientific inquiry, they were all the same thing.
Yeah, Isaac Newton is the classic example of that. Most of Newton's writing was on alchemy. The vast majority of it, when he wasn't pretty much inventing modern physics or running the Bank of England.
And that's what I didn't understand, was that without alchemy, there is no chemistry. There is no biology in the modern sense that produced medicine.
Exactly. And the interesting thing there, of course, is how often Western views of that completely leave out the fact that a lot of this came from the fact the Muslim sources, particularly Sufi sources, were still working with what was supposedly the lost Greek corpus, which a lot of it, which was not available in Europe during the Dark Ages for one reason or another. Most of it was just kept in monasteries and being copied over and over again. But the Muslims were still working with that gear. They still had the writings of Galen to base their medicine on. Alchemy is an Arab word, alchemia, the dark art, with chem being the pun, which means either dark or secret or the literal meaning of the word, the name of Egypt, which is called the Dark Land because of the dark rich soil of the Nile. So even that word alchemy is a triple pun.
Yeah, and all those owl words, they go back to Arab cultures. Algebra is
Yes.
absolutely. So I think as well, that's going into the idea of Orientalism and the kind of imperial gaze.
Yes.
And I guess it takes us back to the meaning of the word occult, in that it doesn't mean opposed to light. It doesn't mean dark. It means occluded. It means hidden.
Yeah, and the thing that I've always thought about why it's hidden, I mean, yeah, there's various reasons. One was, you had to kind of hide that stuff so the Inquisition didn't kill you.
Yeah.
Also because, generally, these practices are kept secret, and then, that has a certain aura to it, and it intensifies experiences and so on. But what I think the actual reason is that whatever magic and weird shit is, it is extremely hard to put in human language. We can only really describe it in metaphor. That any kind of like mathematical system to try and describe this stuff is always going to be missing something because of that subjectivity, because of this innate thing where it's basically describing the relationship between the observer and the universe, and every observer is different, and each observer is different from moment to moment. So magic is an attempt to try and, I think, build an internal continuity of all those different people we are at different stages in our lives, and try and arrange for them to be able to talk to each other and to talk to the universe and have something useful to say about it. There's a very good recent book about magic by a guy called Aidan Wachter. It's called 6 Ways. It's one of the best introduction manuals on magic I've read in years, and I'd recommend it highly to anybody. And what he talks about is something he calls the field. And the field is basically Tao. It's the entire universe out there that we can't actually describe. All we can describe are our relationships across the border to it. And I think all magic and occult systems are mostly describing the observer rather than what the actual field is, because we can't know that. The Tao that is expressed is not the eternal Tao. Is one of the oldest ideas in philosophy. The idea that as soon as you try and put something into words, into symbols, something is lost. There's an immediateness, something that's pre-verbal, pre-linguistic in all this weird shit, like the wow moment. And for me, a lot of magic is basically, it's the field notes that people jotted down after the wow. And to treat them as anything more than that, to treat them as some kind of innate truth given to them for the universe, gets you into trouble very, very quickly.
And in a way that agrees with a lot of philosophers, what like Slavoj Zizek would say about ideology, which is that you can't view an ideology from out with the field of ideology, and that any ideology that talks about itself as non-ideological is itself completely at its most ideological. Maybe there's something there in terms of the field of the real. The minute that you perceive it, it's not real.
Yeah, and so what we have to do is we have to kind of like come up with these sets of symbols to try and compare notes, if we want to. I mean, a lot of people hoard their notes themselves. So, no, you can't do this until you've come into our tradition and you've got X degrees, and so we can't tell the real secrets to you. But generally, they're not actually real secrets as such. It's like you get to these higher levels, and you go, oh yeah, there's a bit of sex magic in there. Oh really? You shock me, sir. how original and completely unprecedented. But so what I like is when I can sit down with magicians and just cut all the bullshit and just compare notes as people who've experienced the wow.
How much does this concern you, this kind of not new, but resurgent connection between kind of magic and ritual and the far right?
It concerns me greatly, and the only thing that I say about it is you have to take a stand against it. So it's something that's very explicitly come up from Hookland, as I say, has this very, very explicit no Nazis thing. The wonderful Twitter tradition of the last few years of Folklore Thursday.
I love Folklore Thursday, yeah.
Just wonderful. But they've had, in the last year or two, they've had a whole bunch of fash showing up, insisting on the kind of Volkish nationalist version of things as being the absolute truth, and all this other stuff is just later leftist invention. And but this stuff goes way back. In the actual origins of the Nazi Party came from, the whole Volkish movement.
Yeah.
Drew heavily on these ideas of working with the land and the deep spirituality of ruralness. Basically it's kind of like the backwash of romanticism, as a kind of resistance against the idea of cities, essentially, of urbanization, of industrialization. So you had romanticism as this big kind of counterblast against that. And it always had this elitist, pure blood kind of bollocks to it, even back then in like the 1820s and 30s.
In that sense, is it always atavistic when it recurs? I
think so. Yeah, it tends strongly to be atavistic, but they're not above nicking the new stuff either. They're perfectly happy to do that because they're fucking Nazis. It's not complicated. It's like that old thing of perfectly well from the music scene that if you've got a club and you let the Nazis in, then it's a Nazi club from that point onwards. They'll just come in and they'll just swamp it, and they just take over whatever they fucking touch. The idea that this is acceptable in this day and age horrifies me. I'm from a shithole of town in Kent called Gravesend, Stocktown on the Thames. It's literally only known for the fact that it's where Pocahontas is buried. That's its only claim to fame. I mean, just down the road in Dartford is where Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were born. So a slight bit of fame for that. But that area, that particular part of the Thames estuary, has been a kind of fascist stronghold area since I was a kid. I mean, I grew up in late 60s, early 70s, seeing swastika graffiti everywhere, people chanting on the street, if you don't support the front, you're a cunt. And this is what I remember from my childhood. And I was naive enough to think it was gone. And this turnaround, this revival of it as something that people actually want or think is valid or good or worth having, it disgusts me on the cellular level. And I just will stand against it. I will absolutely refuse to bow down to any kind of fascist agenda anywhere, particularly in the things I love.
I think, if you look at the guys like the Boogaloo, that were formed out of meme culture, that has heavy resonances with what we were talking about in terms of sigils and rallying points around images and archetypes. You've got people writing these manifestos that influence each other and then become other manifestos and kind of contain these recurring tropes. Like it's almost like a lot of the kind of bubbling underneath, not politically organized but very politically opinionated, that side of the right, are drawing on things that kind of maybe do have their origin in stuff like chaos magic. Do you think that's conscious or unconscious? I don't know.
In some places it is very, very conscious. There are people who just of that tendency, whether they've been kind of weaponized by the internet, which absolutely has happened. I don't know if you know the work of the writer John Robb.
Yeah.
The guy who invented the term fourth generation warfare. And his idea is that modern communications technology has brought us to the point where force projection, in terms of the amount of damage a single person can do, has increased massively to the point with things like the internet, with things like the easy availability of drones, that effectively, if you want to be, anybody can become the equivalent of a supervillain.
Genocide in a can kind of thing.
They got the amount of kit that would be normally that back in the day would only have been available to a Bond villain. Yeah, but the problem really came, and that's absolutely there, and it does appear in certain occult frames. There's a horrible sense of accelerationism in a lot of the kind of back to the land philosophies in the occult, the kind of apocalyptic witchcraft tendency of saying, "Oh yes, we should go back to land. We should all just become hunter gatherers and go back into tribes because it's better now because modernism is rubbish and plastic is evil."
It's that kind of eco-fascist current.
Yeah, exactly that. But what they don't do, and what they really don't like you telling them, and which I've done on several occasions, is to say, "Oh, what you're asking for is the genocide of billions, including pretty much all disabled people." And as a crip with titanium in my spine, I really fucking take objection to that. In the next month or so, the magazine Rituals and Declarations will be having its fourth and last issue. It was always designed to be a four-season project in 2020. A guy called Paul Watson. And I have the honour of having an article in the last one which talks about all this stuff, which is called Plastic Alters Titanium Bones, which I hope some of you will go out and read when it comes out next month.
Fantastic. I mean, you talk about ritual there in the title of the magazine, and I guess that actually leads me into my final question, which is very neat. You almost anticipated that, like some kind of magician. So, given that the dark forces are massing, given that in your practice you kind of talked about how ritual has helped you, but also helped you help others, what can we do in a sense of like cultivating ritual behavior in a good way in our lives as beginners?
As beginners, yeah, go out and get that book 4 Ways. That is an excellent introduction in some of the basic techniques. Find something basic. Grant Morrison's Pop Magic article, which is an excellent introduction to sigils, is out there. Just go out there, start doing some stuff. Be aware that it can bring out the dark side, what they call shadow work, that it's not all fluffy bunnies, it's not all peace and love. And if you treat it like it is, you're going to get bit in the arse quite nasty. It's probably a good idea to learn some kind of protective or defensive technique, some kind of shield work, some kind of grounding, some way to define your space as safe before you go into these realms, because it's big stuff. It drags out every aspect of your personality if you go into this kind of thing deep. And when you're doing that in a group, you're going to get the usual problems of group dynamics, where you're going to get someone who wants to be the high hegian and other people who just want to be the kind of supplicators of that, and people who just want to follow. So my advice would be like, work on yourself, find perhaps small groups of people to work with, find something that stirs you. It's got to really grab you by the heart and balls or other genitalia. That it's got to be something that draws you in, becomes all-encompassing while you're there. But always remember just to take that little step backwards and look at it and go, yeah, I'm going to treat that as if it was real, as if that God is real, as if that really happened and changed the universe, not as real. Don't let yourself ever get trapped in dogma, particularly one you've invented yourself. And yeah, talk to the land. You don't have to make a big thing out of it. These ideas of psychogeography, of the derive, as being some kind of scholarly pursuit. It's not. It's just getting out there and feeling what your local place is like. It may have things that relate to you in the form of spirits. It might just be a vibe. It might just be like a friendly corner you can work in. But you can do this anywhere. It doesn't have to be rural. It doesn't have to be sacred. It doesn't have to be a big back to nature thing. You can do this in a back alley. You can do this in a McDonald's. You can do this anywhere you can draw breath.
That's a fantastic place to finish. Listen, I hope you'll come back on, Kat, and talk about some more of these ideas.
Love to, mate. It's been a hoot.
Listen, I've got so much more to ask you about, so thank you very much for that, and enjoy the rest of your day, man. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
You too. Take care, Bram. Be good, mate.
So that was writer and magician Ian Cat Vincent. We've got a link to his blog in the description of this episode. He mentioned a few books in our chat today as well. If you subscribe to our newsletter at bit.ly/Strange Exiles, we'll post links to those books. Whether you leave this episode today believing in magic or not, I hope it's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you'll join us for next month's guest, radical poet David Lee Morgan. You've been listening to Strange Exiles. Take care of each other.